Hello, it's Scott Manley here. We are halfway through December and we have had a ton of news in the last couple of weeks. It is indeed time for a lot of deep space updates. And we rewind, of course, to the launches, going back to the 3rd of December over in China, where there was a Long March 3B/E out of Xichang, launching a satellite called Tongxin Shishu Xi'an 13. Now, this is believed to be a missile early warning satellite, but previous versions of these satellites went into geostationary orbit, while this one has gone into a highly eccentric orbit with an apogee in the southern hemisphere. Its perigee is about 2,000 kilometers and its apogee is up around 39,000. And its inclination is 63.42, which makes it a Molniya orbit in the southern hemisphere. I don't see that very often. 4th of December, we had a Kuaizhou 1A Pro. That is a new version from X-Space. It launched from Xichang carrying a satellite called Haishao 1, also known as AirSat 8 or Sea Sentinel 1. So this is a marine environment monitoring satellite. It's believed to have a synthetic aperture radar payload and an optical payload. It's in a 500 kilometer, 42 degree orbit. But yeah, this is a maiden flight of a new upgraded version of the Kuaizhou 1A. Specifically, the upper stages are now the same diameter as the rest of the rocket, so it's a clean line up the side, making the upper stages fatter, and that gives them about 50% more payload to low Earth orbit. 4th of December, Falcon 9 Starlink Group 6-70, 24 of those out of Slick 40 on the East Coast, but it was the first 24th reflight of a booster, or sort of 24th flight of booster 1067. So congratulations there. And another landmark launch count over in Russia with Soyuz 2.1B from carrying a spacecraft called Cosmos 2580, which we believe is a Lotos low Earth orbit electronic intelligence satellite out of Plesetsk. And according to people who count these things and put it on Wikipedia, this is the 1000th launch of an R7 derived rocket. Of course, originally developed as a ballistic missile, never used in that. It instead became Soyuz, as it became Sputnik, Soyuz, Molniya, etc., etc. 5th of December, a Falcon 9 carrying 20 Starlink out of Vandenberg Space Force Base, and this is supposedly the final batch needed to complete the direct-to-cell constellation, so that's another landmark. 5th of December, Long March 6A, Qianfan 18 into low Earth orbit, polar orbit. This is the third batch of satellites for the 1,000 Sails constellation, which is a Chinese potential competitor to Starlink. 5th of December, over in India, we have a PSLV XL launching a very international mission in the form of Proba 3. So this is actually two spacecraft, and they're in a highly elliptical orbit that is down at like 600 kilometer perigee and a 60,000 kilometer apogee. It's about a 20-hour orbit. And this is actually two spacecraft performing high precision formation flying. So one of them is a coronagraph, a camera that's designed to look at the outer atmosphere around the sun. The other one is an occulter. It is basically a disk which will move in front of the sun and produce artificial solar eclipses. So these will fly a couple of 100 meters apart. And the thing about coronagraphs is that you can only get so close to the surface of the sun before your aperture starts to let in light around the side. So you have to make your focal length longer and longer, and just by having these things as two separate spacecraft, you can get much closer to the surface of the sun than other traditional single-piece coronagraph systems. So this will hopefully give us the idea of better, more consistent look at the corona around the sun in visible light and other frequencies. 5th of December, Falcon launched a Sirius XM-9 into geostationary orbit. So this is actually a replacement for Sirius XM-7, which launched in 2020 and then failed in 2021. So yeah, launched out of the East Coast. Now, these are the geostationary satellites launched by Sirius Sirius XM. If you remember, Sirius put their stuff into tundra orbits, and XM put it into geostationary orbits before they merged in 2005. And they're trying to replace the geostationary satellites which were launched by XM prior to the merger. 5th of December, Vega C magnificently returns to flight carrying Sentinel-1C into a sun-synchronous orbit at 700 kilometers, carrying a C-band synthetic aperture radar instrument that captures images day and night, and very soon after launch, they've already posted some really cool shots from that. They also have like onboard marine tracking hardware. So yeah, it was a busy day. By my count, that's 5 launches on the 5th of December. On the 6th of December, Iran launched the Seamorg, carrying a payload called Saman-1 and some other smaller payloads. So this is the second successful flight of the Seamorg, which has had all sorts of problems. But this is also the heaviest payload that Iran has launched into orbit. It's about 300 kilograms with its ride-along payloads. It's believed that this is like a space tug that's supposed to be able to act as a kick stage to put other satellites into higher orbits and change orbits afterwards. There's also the Fakir-1 satellite. But yeah, this is, heaviest payload that's been put out into orbit. Finally, Iran's space agency has taken the lead back from the, Revolutionary Guard. 8th of December, there was a Falcon 9 carrying Starlink 12-5, 23 of those out of Slick 40 in Florida. 12th of December, we had a Long March 2D, which also had the YZ-3 restartable upper stage carrying, okay, I'm not even going to try this. It's a high-speed laser diamond constellation experimental system. There's 5 of those going into low Earth orbit, so it's believed that this is like a laser communications experiment between satellites, a bit like what Starlink does. But having the YZ-3 stage on board allowed them to move the satellites into different orbit. There's like 3 of them in 1,000 kilometer orbit. There's another one that's slightly higher, and there's another one that's slightly lower. They're all in like a 60-degree orbital plane. 13th of December, Falcon 9 Starlink out of Vandenberg, 22 satellites. 16th of December, we saw a Long March 5B, the biggest thing that China has, with a YZ-2 upper stage. Yes, this launched 10 satellites into polar orbit. Supposedly, the first 10 satellites for the 13,000 satellites Go Wang or Jingwang mega constellation, right? And yeah, this is the maiden flight of this, YZ-2 upper stage. We've previously seen the Long March 5B, and it's usually been used for big, heavy payloads. Things like space station modules or the Chang'e 5 and 6 lunar return vehicles. I've not seen it used to launch a commercial payload like this into low Earth orbit. And I'm going to say, if you need a Long March 5B to launch your satellites, it's going to be a very expensive constellation. It might be that they don't actually need, a Long March 5B, and they just found a cheap ride because of the experimental, kick stage that was on this. Anyway, 16th of December, Long March 2D into sun-synchronous orbit, carrying the PiSat X-band synthetic aperture radar satellite. Again, it's believed that these are 4 satellites which work as a constellation. We've seen a couple of launches of these previously. And on the 16th of December, a Falcon 9, not carrying Starlink, carrying GPS-3 SV7 in what was a rapid response mission. And this is fascinating because the GPS-3 satellite was supposed to be launched by Vulcan, but of course, Vulcan is taking its time getting through the approval process. And apparently a few months ago, the Air Force or Space Force said, you know what, let's see how quickly SpaceX can get this launched. So they pulled the satellite out of storage, they modified the payload adapter, and SpaceX didn't even announce it was launching this until the 13th. It was on the pad, ready to go, and then they scrubbed it because of the weather. It launched on the 16th successfully. Okay, those are the launches. There was also like a HASTE launch on the East Coast, hypersonic test launch for Rocket Lab. But look, by far the biggest and most consequential news of the last couple of weeks has been Trump's nominee for NASA. And you probably heard by now, it's Jared Isaacman, right? The guy that funded 2 space missions, right? He went on Polaris Dawn, did his own EVA. He previously flew on Inspiration 4. And I'm going to say, I was not expecting him to be nominated. Not because he wasn't qualified, but because prior to the election, he made no endorsements of any political candidates, and that is completely different than everyone else that Trump has selected. This is the work of Elon, who has the president's ear and his, just saying, this is the guy for you. And I'm going to say I kind of agree so far. I think that Jared's well suited. He's managed large private companies. He's obviously a space fan, right? We love that. But he's also, importantly, a huge fan of the first A in NASA. He previously had a private air force, the Draken International. And look, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. There's obviously some questions about, like conflicts of interest, as usual. And he has announced that he will resign as CEO of Shift 4, which is his payment company, when he's confirmed. I did see a comment, by the way, from some people saying, oh, finally, Trump picks a NASA administrator who's been to space. And I thought that was hilarious because, of course, both Bolden, who was Obama's administrator, and Nelson, who was Biden's administrator, have been to space. Like, Bolden was an astronaut on 4 different shuttle missions. He commanded 2 of them. And one of those shuttle missions also had Bill Nelson as payload specialist. Right, but I will say that Jared is the first one that I can see to have performed an EVA, and not only that, an experimental EVA, like in a new spacesuit. It's also worth mentioning, by the way, that Bolden was the pilot of STS-31, which launched Hubble, something that Isaacman was really interested in saving, right? In basically performing a maintenance mission on for Polaris Dawn 2. And that, of course, had been rejected by people at NASA, but maybe that won't be rejected so much anymore. At least the idea of servicing Hubble. Of course, it's highly unlikely that he will fly future Polaris Dawn missions while administrator of NASA, so we will lose that side of things. I don't know, I'm excited. I think that the fact that he is not being so hugely, he hasn't been particularly political. In fact, we've seen that he has previously donated to many Democratic candidates, so that puts him much closer to the middle, and that makes him, good for me. Anyway, look, I'm going to say I'm excited. I think he's a great guy. And I hope that, of course, while we've heard, SLS is on the chopping block, again, I just looked at who's on the Appropriations Committee, and guess what? We've got a senator from Alabama that makes a ton of money from SLS. So I don't know if that is still guaranteed to happen. There is possibly a deal where they say make Space Force HQ move from Colorado to Alabama, but you've got a whole lot of other interests involved, and Congress moves very slowly and needs a lot of favors to make work. Okay, moving onwards. In Scotland, Orbex have announced that they're stopping work on their spaceport in Sutherland in the north of Scotland, and they're moving their plans up to Saxe-Vord in the Shetland Islands. And that, puts them alongside, ABL. Well, ABL probably aren't launching out of there anymore. And then there's Rocket Factory Augsburg and Skyrora, all looking at Shetland Islands. And it's still technically Scotland. It's a little harder to get to. You can't really drive. You have to take a ferry or a plane. But, one of these days I want to get up there. Okay, Artemis 2, which had previously been scheduled for launch in September 2025, surprised nobody by having its launch delayed to April of 2026. And I don't know if there's any margin in that. So yeah, it could be delayed from there. And of course, that delay then pushes Artemis 3 back because they need, the facilities to 2027 at the latest, or earliest. And that will mean, of course, that they also have to have Starship, Lunar Starship working, all the support stuff. But yeah, part of the delay, they finally revealed the whole issue with the heat shield where we had chunks spallating out of the bottom. It looks like there were microscopic air bubbles or small air bubbles under it. And as they went through the first skip, the heat flows through the shield, causes those bubbles to expand, and it pops the chunks off the outer layer. So they're not going to replace the heat shield. They are going to modify the skip re-entry profile, which so it'll reduce the first skip in duration, so they'll lose less energy this time, and then come back in further down range. Hopefully that will mean that the heat pulse doesn't get hot enough to cause this breakage. In the larger world of Artemis, the Artemis Accords have reached the landmark of 50 signatories to this treaty for how to treat the moon. And this is Panama and Austria both coming on board at the same time to push it over that threshold. Spin launch, we haven't heard a lot of them recently after their initial launch tests, and What they have done, which is fascinating, is they put out a video talking about the world's first ruggedized satellite, a satellite which can handle the 10,000 Gs required to launch it on the spin launch system. And this is a great video. Honestly, it's brilliant because that's one of the things that people talk about, a lot of the high G forces and stuff. But yeah, they take it apart. They show how they, for example, the batteries have to be contained in these carbon fiber, cylinders so that they don't balloon out and break under the massive G loads. I think those are the hardest components. And they put it, of course, inside a big, centrifuge system. Honestly, this kind of work is the kind of thing that could have been done by like a YouTuber if they happened to have access to a 10,000 G centrifuge. Cool stuff. Honestly, I think they should make the centrifuge like the new hydraulic press channel. Just think about it. There's all sorts of cool stuff you could crush at 10,000 Gs. Okay, moving onwards. Stoke Space, they put out some video of their awesome hot fire of their Block 2 engine, booster engine. This is, of course, a full flow stage combustion Methalox engine for the first stage of their rocket. It's very nice to see that they're moving that forward. At some point, I'd like to see a booster flying. Blue Origin, they have their full stack getting fueled, covering it with frost, getting the New Glenn logo disappearing, so it's now W Glenn. Yeah, they've performed a first stage test, a second stage fueling test, and they've announced that they are proceeding to a full wet dress rehearsal next week. And at the rate they're going, I don't think they're going to launch before the end of the year because that would probably require a whole bunch of people staying home over Christmas. And I don't think they're that desperate to get in before the end of the year. There's no payload that is is driving their schedule. In fact, they showed pictures of inside the fairing, and it looks like there's no payload because the fairings are so big and the tiny blue ring payload is so small in there. Yes, it has lots of room. The first couple of weeks of December also sees the annual meeting of the American Geophysical Union, and that took place in Washington. There was a bunch of cool stuff that has come out of that. I could do a whole separate video on the science stuff that comes out of that. But the one thing I did do a video on was they published the crash report, the conclusions of why Ingenuity crashed. And it came down to the terrain that they were flying over was very, very smooth, lots of nice undulating dunes, which was terrible for their navigation system. It got confused, made an emergency landing that was hard. They launched it again, and then it crashed again and broke the whole thing. And now it's going to live until its power, stops working, but we're going to lose contact from it in the next month. Also in that little press conference, they put out this little trailer for Chopper, which is a 6-rotor rover. Like, it's the equivalent of a rover, but it flies around Mars, right? This is not this tiny little demonstrator which worked so hard and flew for so long. It seems that they've pulled the larger, higher resolution trailer from YouTube for now, so I expect there will be some actual NASA press release that puts that out. Another really interesting story was someone that was analyzing space traffic control as a result of the solar storms. So yes, we've had a couple of amazing aurora events this year. You've seen beautiful photos of the aurora dancing at latitudes which normally never comes down to because we're of course at peak solar activity. Well, it turns out that when those solar flares kick up, they put out so much energy, it heats the atmosphere, it balloons it out. And suddenly all those Starlink satellites that have planned their orbits for the next few days find that instead of decaying 40 meters per day, they're decaying 200 meters per day. And that means that all their orbit predictions are out the window. They have to maneuver. And this beautiful graph shows all these thousands of satellites suddenly deciding to make maneuvers to make sure that they aren't going to interact with any of their potential neighbors. Down in Boca Chica, SpaceX have been testing both the booster and the Starship for Flight 7. And this does include the first V2 Starship, right? The main changes to this are larger propellant tanks, repositioned forward flaps, and possibly some kind of tower catch anchor points. And we're not sure how that will survive re-entry, and I don't think SpaceX are either. That's why they're flying it. And by the way, We've been calling it Boca Chica. It's officially applied, legally to be incorporated as a city of Starbase. So I guess we'll have to start referencing that now. And also the booster test shots, got some new camera angles, including a camera underneath the engines during the hot fire, which is, well, hot to go. SpaceX are also getting back to building out launch facilities for Starship and Super Heavy in Roberts Road facility in Florida. We can see like launch mount hardware coming in, ready for assembly out in the East Coast. Rocket Lab, by the way, have also been building out their launch mount for Neutron at Launch Complex 3 in Virginia. They showed us some photos of the 160-ton piece of hardware with the launch deck and the water deluge system. And I also missed this a couple of weeks ago where they showed off the Neutron second stage performing the wet dress rehearsal, getting all chilled up for that. Virgin Galactic, they signed an agreement to study flights out of the south of Italy, right? And this is not necessarily a new story. They've talked about it before. But given that half the fun of suborbital flight is looking down, I would rather look down over the Mediterranean. And by the way, I did the math, and based upon the altitude of a Virgin Galactic flight, you should be able to see Africa and Asia as well as Europe from this thing. Now, it's going to be amazing. I'm not knocking New Mexico, by the way. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. The Lucy mission made another flyby of the Earth, picking up enough speed from this to finally get all the way out to the Jupiter Trojans. On its way, it's gonna fly past 52246 Donald Johansen on April 20th of next year. And then it'll start flying past the Jupiter Trojans in 2027, although confusingly, since they are on the Greek side, it will actually be flying past the Greeks rather than the Trojans and the Trojan point. Also, yes, we talked about how Starlink, direct-to-cell hardware was now sufficiently complete to offer service. Well, T-Mobile has opened up a beta for Starlink, people who want to test Starlink connectivity if they have it. So if you have a T-Mobile account in the US, check out that, see if that's your kind of thing. Also, yes, one of the bigger stories that has been on my radar for the last few weeks has been all the drone sightings around the US. And boy, a lot of this. Now, there are probably some real drones out there for sure, but a lot of the ones that I've been seeing have been planes, very obviously planes. There's been a few glowing spinny orbs, which are stars that have just been zoomed in and people don't understand how to focus their camera. And yes, we had a former governor of a US state pointing at Orion, the constellation, and saying these drones are just hanging there. And it makes me despair for the quality of education in this country, to be honest. But there were real drone incidents, and most notably in California, somebody modified a drone, a commercial drone by the sound of things, and flew it up well above the software capped altitude and through the geofencing so that he could look at stuff in Vandenberg Space Force Base. Flew it out of Ocean Park, which is near the Amtrak station. Probably was interested. I don't know what side they were interested in, but it said that it flew for over an hour. So I think that's actually multiple flights with battery replacements. And of course, the real kicker here is this is a guy called Yinpao Zhu, who is a Chinese citizen, also a permanent US resident, and about soon to be more permanent, I think. Boy, yeah, don't fly drones. No matter, it could be he's legitimately just a fan. Maybe not, but it could be. Well, sorry, just don't do it. Oh dear. And I am going to repeat this, even though you as my audience are probably too smart, know this already. If you do see something flying that is moving strangely, that you don't understand, that you think might be some secret government drone that just happens to have lighting that matches aviation lighting, don't shoot at it. Don't point lasers at it, right? Yes, it is a federal offense to point lasers at aircraft because bad things happen to pilots when they get blinded while controlling aircraft. And look, honestly, if it's an aircraft, odds are your gun is not going to be able to reach it and that bullet is going to come down somewhere else. So, best case scenario, you miss, nothing happens. Worst case scenario, you're in jail or people are dead. Please don't do that. I mean, I guess, if it is an alien drone, then maybe that initiates an alien invasion, but that is a distant possibility, hopefully. So that is the deep space updates. Now, over the next couple of weeks, of course, we have solstice, the shortest day of the year, and then we have all those other holidays that we celebrate. We have Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, whatever. So, happy Christmas to you all. Happy holidays for those that celebrate these things. While we in America will be singing about chestnuts roasting on an open fire, of course, Parker's Solar Probe will be roasting next to the sun in its closest approach so far in this mission. And because it's closest, it will also be moving fastest. Faster even than Santa Claus. And speaking of Santa Claus, by the way, I know a lot of you have been asking about these little Kerbal models in the comments. So yes, these have just appeared in my, goodie bag in the last couple of days. Estes Rockets, who of course make model rocketry stuff in America. Great present if you want to get people interested in flying stuff. They made these models, official Kerbal tie-ins. The figures aren't actuated, but you've got Jeb and Valentina. There's 4 different sets, only 2 different Kerbals. The rockets don't actually fly except in one set, which is the one that you should obviously buy. The others are like Christmas tree ornaments or desk ornaments that aren't supposed to fly, but I'm sure some of you will take that as a challenge, and I salute you. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.